specific about the need to address these so-called orphan properties in the context of brownfields, formerly contaminated properties. Frequently, there are abandoned buildings associated with these. In my own riding, which includes the Herring Cove Road, there are any number of commercial properties which have worn the sign, "Opening soon, such and such a business," for 5, 6, and even 7 years. And the question is, when the economic climate is changing so rapidly, when property assessments are climbing so rapidly, what is it that makes these buildings still ready to open and yet no one willing to open them? I have heard, and I believe this to be true, that the problem is that many of these contain significant environmental liabilities. Many of these are built on old dump sites, include oil spills. I can in fact think of one absolutely charming small house which has been boarded up for some length of time because there was an oil spill in the basement when the oil tank was being filled, and this will in fact end up being demolished because the possible liability is not something which has been estimated. In the case of commercial properties, however, particularly in the outskirts of the city, particularly in areas that one might consider suburban now and formerly rural, there are large properties which include abandoned buildings which have been associated with contaminating uses. And who is liable? Right now, the person who's liable is the landowner. And if the landowner sells a contaminated property, the landowner remains liable for that. Now, the federal government, the National Roundtable on Energy and the Environment, has made very, very strong suggestions that there needs to be a regulatory regime in place which deals with this kind of liability, defines it, and puts these properties back into circulation. This bill does not, as far as I can see, make it mandatory for the municipality to expropriate properties, including boarded-up buildings. And therefore, I believe that a number of these buildings are going to remain every bit as much of a problem as ever they were, because the cost of environmental liability is so great. There's another kind of an example, which is an interesting one. At the moment, the province is debating over the assumption of a number of lighthouses. The federal government has deaccessioned and is offering initially to the provinces, then the protocol is to municipalities, then to community groups. The question is, what does it cost to remediate a property which may have been contaminated by the mercury used in the old lights? And in the meantime, these federally owned properties, too, are boarded up. They are orphans. And according to this, presumably, there is even room for an end run here. The federal government is very, very clear that it wants to deaccession without having done the remediation work. So in fact, I would think that one of the largest problems of this legislation is that within HRM, which is not only an urban area, but has included significant industrial tracts of land, there are properties which HRM simply will not want, and neither will any private landowner. I must say I was very pleased to see that we're moving towards the removal of the business occupancy tax, because that at least does, in increasing the commercial taxation basis to a level whether the building is occupied or not, that at least removes some of the incentive many property owners, commercial property owners may have had to leave these buildings empty rather than remediating and reusing or selling. So, as I say, there should be some discussion as to whether, in fact, this power should be required to be exercised, or whether there will be simply a cherry-picking exercise, and a cherry-picking exercise which can indeed be a very lucrative one. One other question around that, perhaps falls in the category of cherry-picking, is just how long the stem is. The notice period is possibly short, and there are questions around who will be establishing the value to be paid for these properties. Once again, whether the property is in fact contaminated has an impact on it, but this is a portion of fair market value, and I see no reason for the need for remediation to lower the price paid. I would also like to make one final caution, and that is returning to the question of vacant versus boarded up versus abandoned versus dangerous versus unsightly. At least some of these are questions in which unsightliness is in the eye of the beholder. And if we are to have a broad and sudden sweep of all boarded up properties of age in a municipality which does not support or encourage the designation of its very valuable heritage buildings, then we do run the risk of a broad and final sweep of some of the last remaining and particularly vernacular heritage buildings in this area. And there is no denying that Halifax and the Halifax Regional Municipality have been a large part of the core of the development of Nova Scotia and tell a great deal of the story of Nova Scotia. We have significant housing issues, we have development pressures, but we must also be sure that we are not, along the way, encouraging a mass demolition which will produce a single age of buildings produced in the wake of this. Even old buildings, even sometimes abandoned buildings, are in fact a part of the texture of the landscape. And I would like to know what is to happen to the buildings once acquired by the municipality. Will they be demolished? Will they be rehabilitated? Will they, in fact, will the municipality perform what's called a double closing exercise? Purchase, hold title long enough to negotiate purchase by an appropriate community group or private owner, and have this building returned to a use which is perhaps close to its original use. The way we regenerate neighborhoods sometimes is one step at a time. It is not sometimes by wholesale clearance. We have seen wholesale clearances in this city, and we continue to suffer the after effects. In fact, we continue to suffer the after effects exactly in those areas where the wholesale clearances did take place before. And that, to me, says something about just how tenable it is to go in and sweep something out simply because it is empty, without making sincere and committed efforts to see it reused. So I would not like to see expropriation be tantamount to a death sentence for every single building, because abandoned does not necessarily mean dangerous, and it does not necessarily mean unsightly. But we could be on a very fast track to unsightly and on a very fast track to abandonment or re-abandonment of larger areas than ever before if, in fact, we don't scrutinize what is to happen to buildings once they've passed into municipal hands. So again, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that the intent of the bill is good. It is, in fact, important that we don't have areas which foster undesirable uses or which become dangerous if they dangerous to trespassers. But at the same time, I believe we need to have proper provisions for public input, and we need to have commitment to ensuring that this is not simply the removal of a building which will leave an environmentally contaminated property behind, or the removal of a building which opens up an extraordinarily large tract of accompanying land to unknown disposition. We do, in fact, still have a basic premise of respect for landowners' rights, and I would like to ensure that property owners do, in fact, receive appropriate notice and chance to remediate, and that having failed to do so, that there is, in fact, community input into the fate of these buildings and properties. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will sit down. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. On an introduction, I will recognize the member from Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring the House's attention to the West Gallery. In the West Gallery this evening, we have the Clearwater employees, CAW Local 596. And as I call their names, I'd ask them to stand and be recognized by the House. First, we have Linda McNeil, Susan Burrows, Wanda Gracie, Darlene McNeil, Ruby Robinson, Lynn LeBlanc, Heather Bungay, Jackie Evans, and Bonnie McRae. And I'd like for them to receive a warm welcome of the House, please.
Well, we certainly welcome our special guests here today and hope they enjoy the proceedings of the House. We'll now recognize the member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just briefly on this bill, number 256, the Municipal Government Act, I tend to share some of the concerns of my colleague from the NDP from Cape Breton Nova. Those concerns, I said I share the concerns, not the ideals, but I share those concerns, Mr. Speaker, because of the fact that I'm left wondering, the minister will probably be able to explain this further, why this applies to Halifax Regional Municipality, why it doesn't apply to other regional municipalities, specifically the Cape Breton Regional Municipality. Mr. Speaker, if the minister wants to see abandoned, vacant, dilapidated, substandard, unsightly, boarded up houses, pay a visit to Glace Bay, Mr. Speaker. Come, I'll show you what happens in the community when the bottom line on this one, Mr. Speaker, is we have to deal with this, of course, as legislators, but if affordable housing was there in the first place, these structures would have been torn down long ago and replaced with decent, affordable housing for the people that deserve it in the first place, Mr. Speaker. So those that are boarded up, and that's my main question here right now, is not, as some of the members have posed, what's the difference between a boarded up building or a vacant building or an unsightly premise? And as again, I can show you all of the above in Glace Bay. These lead to a lot of problems. Number one, especially in an area such as Cape Breton, in the area that I come from, still has a number of homes which you call duplexes in Halifax, which we call company homes in Cape Breton. And these company homes are, in some cases, over 100 years old, Mr. Speaker. You tear down one half, the other half is left to fix up. One of the major problems that you have is that finding the actual funding for the homeowners, who are usually living on fixed incomes and so on, Mr. Speaker, to fix up the other half of that building. It also leads to some problems with everything from rats to mice to arson to parties, drinking, drug parties that are held in those abandoned buildings, Mr. Speaker. So it is not that I don't welcome the legislation. It's welcome. I'm just left wondering why only one municipality. And I understand as well, Mr. Speaker, that there may be a cost factor involved here, and the costs of the regional municipality would have to bear, and whether or not some municipalities in this province would actually want to bear that cost, as opposed to perhaps the ability of the Halifax Regional Municipality to accept this cost, Mr. Speaker. So those are some of the questions that I have regarding Bill 256, the Municipal Government Act, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, member. I'll now recognize the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Service, Nova Scotia, to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I feel like I've spent 2 hours and 10 minutes in the dentist chair without any freezing. The member for Halifax Shibukto talked about Dylan's rule, and I thought he was referring maybe to Bob Dylan. You know, it's Bob Dylan said you got to serve somebody. This bill is about serving somebody, Mr. Speaker. Halifax Regional Municipality made the request, and we complied with the request. There were a number of questions asked and issues raised during debate, and I'll try to go through some of those. With respect to other municipalities, whether or not they requested or indeed even would like similar powers, I'll say this, that as the member for Halifax Fairview correctly pointed out, we not only consulted with his caucus in terms of providing them with advance notice that we were bringing this forward, and the Liberal caucus, we also approached the UNSM and asked them for their view and input. And at that time, they felt it was reasonable and appropriate to move in this direction. As I said in my opening remarks, if another municipality were interested in having similar pieces of legislation, we would review it and consider it at that time. I would point out to those who are asking for that the provision that enables HRM, if this bill passes in its form, to expropriate these properties is very expensive, and some municipalities may not want to bear that expense. So that's why I would expect that some would see this as being somewhat regressive. And other municipalities, I would say, use other tools to deal with dangerous and unsightly premises within the existing Municipal Government Act. The member for Halifax Fairview also pointed out the difference between what he says is in the letter and the intent of the bill. I'd say this, that the bill actually meets the intent of the council resolution. And our staff worked very closely with staff at HRM to draft this bill, and at the end of the day, we believe we have support of HRM staff in terms of the direction that we went. Having said that, there were a number of speakers that pointed out, in fact, correctly so, that we have to be very careful and ensure that fair market value is achieved to those property owners. There's all kinds of reasons why buildings end up boarded and vacant, including disasters that people have no control over, like a fire. So what we wanted to do was have a level of protection for the property owner, those people who own those buildings, and an authority for the municipality to deal with this issue. I would point out that the Municipal Government Act, in many cases, provide for opportunities for one municipality or another to have powers that others don't have. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There have been cases and examples in this House where we've granted powers to Yarmouth, for example, to levy a tax, to Halifax, for example, to levy a tax for tourism. So there are plenty of examples where in this legislature we've provided opportunities for municipalities to do something that may not be permitted in other municipalities, only based on the request. This bill uses a tried and tested approach using expropriation. I think it's the most appropriate way that we can provide the municipality with a tool to help them resolve some of the dangerous and unsightly premises issues that they've had since I was chairman of the Halifax Regional Municipality Dangerous and Unsightly Premises Committee. I know it's very frustrating for the councillors and for the residents who live in those neighbourhoods, but this provides them with a tool. The member for Dartmouth North pointed out that Manitoba has similar provisions, and I think I informed him of that last week. That's true. But what he didn't say is that Manitoba, although they have provisions in their Municipal Government Act to allow this to happen, they have never used those provisions. The good thing about this act is that it may never have to be used either. It simply provides the municipalities with a level of weight that may enable them the force that's necessary to bring these buildings back into compliance with the Dangerous and Unsightly Premises bylaw. And that's what we're hoping, Mr. Speaker. Again, I would say that the bill reflects the intent of council resolution. The bill uses a fair process that's both tried and tested. Again, I would say that the simple weight of the legislation may be enough to provide council with the tool that they need to ensure that these buildings are complied with. In closing, I would say that I'm appreciative of the comments opposite, that the intent of this bill was to provide both balance and opportunity for the municipality to clean up some of these issues. I know that as a former member of Halifax Regional Municipality, as a former chairman of the Dangerous and Unsightly Premises Committee, they're very, very difficult issues to deal with. The other provisions in the bill around electronic filing, I think, are positive step forward things that enable this municipality in this province, and all municipalities in this province, to move forward with the current age of electronic commerce. So, Mr. Speaker, having said that, I move second reading of Bill number 256.
Thank you, Minister. The motion then is for second reading on Bill number 256. Is the House ready for the question? Will all those in favor signify by saying aye? Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 256, an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
Ordered that this bill now be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I'll now recognize the, I guess the member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just on a point of order, and I just want to advise the minister responsible for municipal relations that when I was speaking about the Manitoba legislation, I did indicate, and Hansard will show that tomorrow, that I did indicate that it never had to come into force, although it's a good piece of legislation that caused the municipalities and some landlords to come to grips with the issue.
Thank you, member, but that's not a point of order. We'll now go to the Deputy Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, call Bill number 258, Building Code Act.
Bill number 258, the Building Code Act. Will recognize the Minister of Housing.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Minister of Environment and Labour, I move second reading of Bill number 258, the Building Code Act.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We'll now recognize the honourable member from Halifax Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising to speak briefly to the amendments to the Building Code Act. I had been hoping that the responsible minister could say a bit more than the Minister of Community Services just said. I know he's standing in for the other minister, but you kind of hope that on second reading, which is debate in principle, the government could lay out a little better what the bill's about. What's it for? Why is this before the legislature? And after over 4 years in this place, it continues to disappoint me to see government ministers stand up and basically say, I move second reading, without any indication of what the bill says or what it's for or why this is a good thing or why we ought to vote in favor of it. I am grateful to the Department of Environment and Labour for providing a briefing to us on the bill, which I received late Friday afternoon. The gist of the bill is to professionalize municipal building inspectors, essentially, and there's a number of changes and consequential changes to the Building Code Act in order to accomplish that purpose. Now, my introduction to this whole subject of building inspectors was when I was a relatively new MLA, and I sat on the select committee of the legislature dealing with fire safety, and I learned more than most people ever need to know about the building code, the fire code, building inspectors, fire inspectors, and I also learned there's a bit of tension between the two about the respective areas of responsibility and professional qualification. So it is my understanding, subject to anything we might hear in the Law Amendments Committee, that this bill receives a general support from the municipalities and from the building inspectors, and what it should do is professionalize that industry. And there are a few other changes, minor, very, very minor things. For example, it's over 10 years ago that the County Court of Nova Scotia was abolished, and this bill now, more than 10 years later, is just changing the references to the County Court so that it means Supreme Court, that kind of housekeeping thing. It is interesting, though, Mr. Speaker, last Wednesday night I had occasion to at a dinner for Habitat for Humanity, which I might add is a very, very worthwhile organization, charity, has an annual fundraising dinner that I attended again this year. I happened to be sitting at a table with a fellow who owns a door and window company, and he didn't live in my constituency, but we got to talking, and I asked him, as somebody in the building trades, somebody who's supplying this kind of material to new homes, what if you could change one thing, or if you could say one thing to politicians about what you and your business and your industry needs, what would it be? And I thought it could have covered the whole range of things. Could have been taxes, it could have been regulation, it could have been all kinds of things. But what he said to me was, the one thing that I need is the building code to be enforced. So there's nothing wrong with the building code as it stands, or actually I might not go that far because I think my colleague from Cape Breton Centre actually might want to remark on that. The building code is fine. The problem is, how do you enforce it? Because especially in the big municipalities like HRM, where there's hundreds of projects going on at any given time, the time of the building inspectors is at a premium. And they can't be everywhere all the time. And what this fellow who owned the door and window company said, that what happens is that his windows and doors get put into projects very shoddily, And the builders, they know exactly how to cover it up so the building inspector can't see their work. And then when the windows and doors leak, he gets the call and says, there's something wrong with your windows and doors. And he says there's absolutely nothing wrong with these windows and doors. They're top of the market, top quality. The problem is the way that they were installed and the fact that the people who are installing them know exactly how to cover up the fact that they're not following the building code. So I had a lovely chat last Friday afternoon with a fellow at the Department of Environment and Labor who deals with building code matters, and I put this to him, and he said, really, at the end of the day, I don't want to quote him, I don't want to purport to quote him. The gist of what he was saying was that at the end of the day, there's really nothing you can do. There's really nothing you can do. If you can't have a building inspector on site all the time, there's really nothing you can do. And all you can do, as with so many other areas of government, is educate the people. Educate the builders about proper code and why it's important that it be followed. But it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that no matter what the code says, you will always have people whose market niche is cutting corners and doing work more cheaply than anybody else. And the reason that they do it more cheaply is simply because they're not following the rules. Maybe they don't know how to follow the rules, or maybe they do, but at any rate, they don't follow the rules. So is this bill actually going to help with that problem, which is identified for me by a business owner as the number one problem? Is it going to help us with enforcement of the building code? Well, probably not. Is it a step forward in some way? Yeah, it probably is, but it's not at all clear that this is going to solve the problem that the good, decent, honest builders of this province that they have with the system. It's not at all clear it's going to solve that problem. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I say we'll be very interested to see whether anybody signs up for law amendments, and if they do, what they have to say about this bill. Thank you very much.
I'll now recognize the member from Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to go on the record saying for our critic who is not present at this time that it's basically a housekeeping piece of legislation. There may be, he did point out that there may be something that the professional body may like changed to a small degree, but for the most part, everything seems fine with this piece of legislation, and certainly prepared to move it on to law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. We'll now recognize the member from Cape Breton Centre.
Well, will he be this impressed when I'm finished? No, you know, Mr. Speaker, this, you know, in some instances, the previous speaker's right. It is housekeeping in some manner, but it's much more than that too. When we talk about the building codes and inspectors, because what we're talking about is not only the idea of someone come in and look at a building, someone's dwelling they may be erecting at one point or another, but we're looking at much of our municipal infrastructure, all of our infrastructure from time to time, and this kind of leads you into one of the areas which kind of worries me in what's not in this bill. And what's not in Bill 258 is bringing up our codes to standards of a national level that would require skilled and authorized tradespeople to do a lot of this work. And that's kind of why do we continuously see from this government bills that are, again, to use that term, housekeeping in nature, but when really this is kind of, I guess, germane to this. We don't need housekeeping. We need a whole house built here, Mr. Speaker, around this bill, because there's many things that are lacking in here, and even some of its proposals. You know, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure where you come from in Pictou County and where I come in CBRM, you know, there's not a lot of rich people there, and there's people that will build a home over a period of time rather than go deep into debt. They'll buy a home and maybe get some money together and either pour a foundation or put a footer in and in the fall, and then next spring, maybe they'll cap it, maybe they'll erect some walls and even if money allows, make it weather tight. But what this is calling for, that there'll actually be limitations on permits. Now, that sounds fine and good if you're doing a large project, but it makes no sense because in a large project, you're confined by a negotiated price anyway and a delivery date, so it makes really, that doesn't impact on this legislation. The person who's going to be impacted on this is the fellow I'm talking about, or the family of modest means who wants to go and build their structure and take their time and get into the structure from little or no expense. You know, Mr. Speaker, I know across the way there's some members over there that can just contract their house out and have it built right on the highway. And I know some of them have great craftsmanship in their homes, and I've seen that. One place in particular, it's a smashing house. Well, I didn't hear what the member said, but it's a nice home when the ministers owned it. But nonetheless, people of more modest means than that member sometimes build a home over a long period of time. And this would be an undue penalty, Mr. Speaker, on them if you put a limitation. When I built my home, or had it built, because, the only real piece of information I got when I was building my home was from my father-in-law, who was a superb carpenter and tradesman, when he told me one very valuable piece of information. He said, how not to hit your finger when you hammer a nail. And you know what he told me, Mr. Speaker? And he's absolutely right. Hold the hammer with two hands. That's the only piece of carpentry wisdom I can. But, Mr. Speaker, this bill is not, in essence, by itself, a bad bill, but there is some flaws in it. I think and I was saying about when constructing my home, that it was built over a period of time to alleviate the possibility of having a large mortgage. And we were fortunate enough to do that. And matter of fact, we started my home in about 79 and moved into it in 81, Christmas of 81, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker. So it was over a period of time. And one of the strangest things over that was when we did get a building permit. And I know, unlike the banana belt in Yarmouth, we have rain and snow in Cape Breton, but yet they give you a cardboard piece of paper cardboard for your permit, and you're supposed to put that outside somewhere, and that's supposed to sustain the weather in Cape Breton. I'm sure it's just a silly thing, and yet. That's what there's no talk about making something more sustainable, like a small, almost like a bike license used to put on bicycles, something that would sustain through the weather. But there's nothing about that in here. But, Mr. Speaker, there's another problem, too, because when we talk about qualifications for inspectors, there was always the joke that in whether it was something like regional housing or something like that, supervisor job always went to the carpenter just because they knew structure. They knew that if the walls wouldn't fall down. But yet, in today's complex construction industry, we have people working on electrical. We'll see people running with hot wires, and we'll see another group in there running low voltage and so on. So it's not, this has now become a much more sophisticated business than it was 10, 15 years ago. One could make the argument, as my friend did before, about well-constructed windows, and windows that come basically as doors do now, pre-hung, and it's just a matter of sliding them into place. But pre-hung, Mr. Speaker, just like a door, pre-hung, Mr. Speaker. So what we do is we have this, and they go. And if the person installing it doesn't really understand the code, or the person inspecting it doesn't realize the manufacturing specs on it, you have problems. So this is why we need to make sure that our inspectors are the best qualified. And so I guess that's what goes back to why aren't we talking in this bill about bringing everything up to the national code?
Good question.
we're not talking about someone who's making a little tables and chairs set for their child's doll tea party, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about building our infrastructure, and yet there's no real discussion in this bill. There's no really thought in this bill about what's going to take place for training in any substantive way. There's been some changes. They contemplate like certain violations and how they will deal with them through the courts and how long they have before they come to the court, Mr. Speaker. And I'm trying not to talk substantively too much on Bill 258, but what I want to do, Mr. Speaker, is the principle of this is it should be broader in nature. That, this bill, as some previous speakers have said, is not a particularly offensive bill, but it's so indicative of bills we've seen come to the House lately from this government that there's nothing substantive in there. When we're asking for leadership and we're asking to show us how this is going to operate in today's construction industry, we'll say it's lacking any substance. There's absolutely no substance in there. It's just we're changing names. We're going from chairman to chair, which are all very good things. But in the substantive world of getting things done and trying to make sure that when people come to build in Nova Scotia, when people come to buy buildings in Nova Scotia, when people pay taxes, all down the line, that they realize that this has been inspected and we have a reasonable assurances that these are good inspections and that they will work and that this building will be safe. It'll be safe not only to live in, but it's safe to work in. So, Mr. Speaker, I will take my place shortly, but I just think that, I wish when the government would take the time and burden our bureaucrats to craft a bill for them, that they would say that it's important that, we've got one shot to get stuff like this right. We're never, probably in most of the legislative time, the members in here are probably never going to see another bill on the building code. So why not take that opportunity to make it the best we can? Instead, we get a skeleton bill, Mr. Speaker. This is a bill that doesn't harm anybody, but in a lot of ways doesn't help anybody, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, member. We'll now recognize the Minister of Labour to close debate then.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today to close second reading on Bill 258, but I do have a few things I'd like to say. Certainly appreciate the comments from across the way. We're looking at making some improvements to the Building Code Act. And one of the improvements that we've endeavored to try and make is that we have minimum qualifications for building officials, and we have stiffer penalties and a more inclusive building advisory committee. And those are some of the issues that are addressed in this bill. And certainly they are there so that we can protect the safety of Nova Scotians. Priority, it's important to have these updates, Mr. Speaker. There's been a lot of work, and I think it'd be worthwhile to point out to the members across the way that there has been a lot of consultation that's gone into this bill. And currently we have letters of support from the UNSM. We also have letters of support from the Nova Scotia Association of Architects, the Association of Professional Engineers in Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia Building Officials Association, Construction Association of Nova Scotia, Disabled Persons Commission, Nova Scotia Home Building Association, Nova Scotia Home Designers Association, the Atlantic Provinces Building Supply Dealers Association, the Nova Scotia and the PEI Regional Council of Carpenters, Millwrights, and Allied Workers, and the Nova Scotia Construction Sector Council. So I just want to point out that this is not something that we brought in very quickly. There's been a lot of work that's taken place, a lot of consultation between the department and those groups that are out there that will benefit from this, as well as all Nova Scotians who will benefit from an increased level of qualification of a building official. So we believe that that's important to the province, important to homeowners and to home builders, and also worthwhile pointing out that these officials or the once inspectors who are officials will be there in a capacity to help individuals who are building their own houses or individuals who are the primary contractor, to be able to work with them and ensure that they are in compliance as they move forward. One of the other avenues that they'll be there for is for contractors who typically go above and beyond the call of duty and make sure that they always follow all codes, but our officials will be there. We'll look at uniform training for these officials from Yarmouth to Sydney, and we'll make sure that they are able to have a level of competence to ensure that buildings are constructed in a safe and orderly manner. And that's not something that we don't have today. However, we felt it necessary to make sure that officials have a level of qualification that we believe is essential for us to move forward in today's changing society, where materials are constantly changing and building processes are improving on a continual basis. So we want to make sure that our inspectors are able to enforce the code and the Act, and there will be work that will continue with the organizations and the groups that I just previously mentioned to make sure that we have everything up to date and in place. It's important, Mr. Speaker, that we improve the building code by setting some standards. And this is, and again, I point out, not something that has come about quickly. It's something that has had a tremendous amount of discussion with a lot of people. We certainly had individuals and staff in the department who have worked tirelessly with people to make sure that we have come up with a bill that will result in an improved level of safety for the province of Nova Scotia. We've also increased the offenses, and I know offenses are a deterrent, but it is important to have a deterrence whenever you're looking at inspection and whenever you're looking at regulation, and you're trying to ensure that people realize the importance of following the codes and the regulations. So under that, fines for an individual can be anywhere from $500 to $25,000, and imprisonment for 1 year for people who don't abide by the codes. And corporations can face fines from $1,000 to $50,000. And for more serious offenses that result in loss of life or catastrophic impact on a community, individuals can be fined up to $150,000 or imprisoned for up to 2 years for each offense. And those are certainly not issues that we want to occur, but I think whenever you put in regulation, whenever you put in acts, you have to have some type of measure to let people know how serious it is to follow the rules of the road and make sure that what they're building very safely. Companies and directors of companies can also be fined up to $250,000, and this brings the Nova Scotia Building Code Act in line with other provincial public safety legislation across our province and across Canada. We've also added the power to order compliance with code, and we have as well added a new sentencing option, which the members opposite would be familiar with, and it allows the courts to require payment into a public education fund, and in addition to any fine that's been levied. So the Occupational Health and Safety Division in our department has used that very successfully, and it's worked very well, we believe. They've used the fund to run ad campaigns and to educate the public about hazards which have led to serious injuries or death. And the company that has been involved is the company that's the focus of the ad, and that illustrates what they could have done to prevent future incidents. And so it not only serves as a deterrent to the company, but it also educates the public in very important issues on workplace health and safety. So this will be a tool that this Act will allow us to have to ensure compliance. So, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to conclude my remarks and thank the members opposite for their interventions and their discussions. And I move second reading of Bill 258. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. The motion then is for second reading of Bill number 258. Is the House ready for the question? Will all those in favor signify by saying aye? Those against say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill 258, entitled an act to amend Chapter 46 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Building Code Act.
Order that this bill now be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Yes, once again, Mr. Speaker, thank you. At this time, I'd like to call Bill number 257, Fisheries and Coastal Resource Act.
Bill number 257, Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act. I'll recognize the Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my privilege to stand tonight and open second reading on Bill 257, which is an act to amend Chapter 25, the Acts of 1996, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act. This one, Mr. Speaker, is a pretty simple housekeeping piece, which simply limits, it removes the limit on the amount that a loan guarantee or the loan or a guarantee of a loan that the board can make without the approval of governor and council to be set by regulations. As you know, over the last few years, the cost of building a vessel has increased dramatically. The limit had been set at about $500,000 over the last number of years. Boats at this point, let's say a 45-foot boat for the lobster fishery is getting in now around $600,000-$700,000. So therefore, every one of those boats has to go through the extra process of preparing documentation to go through cabinet. And we feel that the board of the Fisheries and Aquaculture Loan Board are outstanding people that can make decisions on their own, and we just want to pass it along to them to make that decision. What this does is allows cabinet to make the regulation to set that limit at a point that makes sense. At this point, we're researching that number. That number should range somewhere in between the $1 million mark and a few dollars more. So that people can make those decisions. Just by example, Mr. Speaker, just recently, two boats that did come across our desk, one of them was like $617,000, and of course it takes almost an extra month for that red tape to go through. And another one just recently was well over the $2 million mark. So we are seeing bigger boats, safer boats, ones that use that resource to a better level. So, Mr. Speaker, I will look forward to the remarks to be made by the opposition and by the third party to see what their thoughts are on it. Maybe give us an idea as we go forward to what those spending limits should be. So that, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my place and just open second reading on Bill 257.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I'll now recognize the member from Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak on this bill. Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for introducing it, because it's not very often in this House, considering how much fishery is a part of our provincial culture, our economy, our history, our future, quite frankly, that we don't have many opportunities to speak on these issues, mainly because, under our Constitution, it's a federal issue. But there are opportunities that do arise from time to time, and this is a good jumping-off spot, because I want to say that anything we can do to make it easier to facilitate loans to fishermen to be able to buy the boats that they need to be able to do their job, I say is good for Nova Scotia. I think there needs to be more done. Mr. Speaker, you may know that I represent in Eastern Passage probably around, my guess is 20, maybe 28 boats, and the number of fishermen that would go with that. And the member from Eastern Shore is questioning that, but I can look up my window any day and count them, and I can assure you how many are there. I don't know, 28 boats. I would say there's many more fishermen than that. But, Mr. Speaker, and we also have a fish processing plant there as well. And, Mr. Speaker, this is an ongoing issue in my constituency, as it is for other members in this House. I can look across the way, and of the 25 members that are in the government caucus, I'm sure that over half, if not more, would have fishermen of some number in there. It's probably two-thirds would have fishermen in their ridings, Mr. Speaker. So I'm looking forward to hearing from those members of the government caucus when they stand up to talk about the fishermen in their riding and the issues that they have with regard to fishing, and why this bill, Bill 260, that deals with 257, thank you. Bill 257 is a good start with regard to making it easier for these fishermen, for these communities to maintain the boats in their community, Mr. Speaker. But frankly, a lot more has to be done. And I know that the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture is sympathetic to this, but talk is talk and walk is walk. And it's time that we as a province begin to recognize that this is an important part of maintaining the way of life and the economy in rural Nova Scotia. Rural Nova Scotia has faced, in the past 15 to 20 years, Mr. Speaker, an onslaught of problems that have resulted, not in Nova Scotia, this isn't a problem just in Nova Scotia, it's a problem in Saskatchewan, it's a problem in Nebraska, it's probably a problem in Russia or well, I know it is in China. People leaving rural areas to come to the cities, urbanization of the population, Mr. Speaker, people coming to larger centers because the type of work, the amount of work, and the value of the work, the pay for it, is such that people are enticed to move into cities. It's an ongoing phenomenon around the world, urbanization, people leaving rural communities. But, Mr. Speaker, there are problems that come with that. There are a lot of problems that can come with that. We see it in Metro. We see the ballooning cost of housing. We see homelessness. We see other issues that are arising in HRM that, frankly, and I know from my constituency, a suburban constituency, I go and knock on the doors, Mr. Speaker, and they're from Newfoundland. They're from Cape Breton. They're from rural Nova Scotia. They're from rural New Brunswick. They're from Prince Edward Island. Very few come from other parts of Canada or the United States or the world. Most of them come from rural Atlantic Canada. They're moving to Halifax because, frankly, they want to have some of the lifestyle that is accustomed to living in Atlantic Canada, some of the cultural aspects of it, yet they know the work is here. And, Mr. Speaker, this is destroying our fishing communities. But it's not something that we need to continue to push. And this is my point. There's a difference between recognizing urbanization is happening, that urbanization is something that's a phenomenon happening around the world, and then having government policies that encourage urbanization. And what we have with regard to our fishery, Mr. Speaker, is just that. Between trust agreements, between individual quotas, what we're doing and the transfer of those, Mr. Speaker, is we're creating situations where we're going to have employees working boats. And I believe this has already happened in British Columbia to a great extent, that you have employees working boats making a certain amount of income. But the concept of an owner-operator or the owner, fisherman, one who owns his own boat or her, one that is operating their own license and collecting the quota, whether it's lobster, whether it's tuna, whether it's any number of fisheries, Mr. Speaker, fish species. Mr. Speaker, these people are the heart and soul of communities, not only the employees who are very important and they work, but there's a heck of a lot of money. I think we all know, if you live in a community with a fishing base, there is a lot of money generated by the owner-operators of fishing vessels in Nova Scotia. And that money stays in the community. They're buying houses. They're supplying their boats. They're selling to a local fish plant, Mr. Speaker. All this will change. Maybe some would argue it's changing already. I think it is. But it's not too late to stop. And we're in a situation where both the Nova Scotia government and the federal government is doing little to actually try and stop this onslaught, Mr. Speaker, of trying to prevent the deterioration of the owner-operator of fishing boats in Nova Scotia in the communities. Whether it's through cooperatives, whether it's through community quotas, whether it's through ensuring that, that fishermen are able to transfer their licenses to their children or to other loved ones who want to continue the practice of fishing, both the boat and the license, Mr. Speaker. We need to do something. Otherwise, we're going to have communities throughout this province that are going to have boats being operated by employees, the vast majority of the profit coming from those boats being sent to a central location. Now, it may not all be Halifax yet, it may not be Toronto, but you never know. There are companies based in Halifax that are probably eager to buy out licenses, fish them as employees, and then take most of the profit and keep it for themselves or their shareholders, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is that destroys the economy of rural Nova Scotia. It destroys the economy of these fishing villages and these fishing communities, from Lockport to Digby to even my own in Eastern Passage and beyond, Mr. Speaker. These are places where we have owner-operators operating their own vessels, hiring local people, and from that you end up having what frankly has been a sustainable fishery for 400 years in Atlantic Canada. Since the time of John Cabot, when he dipped that bucket into the water off the Grand Banks and said, there's so many fish here, I can't stop but have a full bucket just by dropping it into the water. Mr. Speaker, we have had a sustainable fishery in Atlantic Canada, in Nova Scotia, for 400 years. The French were fishing in my riding in McNabb's Island in the 16th century, Mr. Speaker, And from then and now, we have a sustainable fishery. And this loan board needs to do more than just deal with the issue of ensuring that you can get a loan, larger loan for a fishing boat, Mr. Speaker. There needs to be more it can do to address the issue of fishing. We need to use the policies of the government through the Fishery Loan Board, through other policies, through advocacy work with the federal government to make sure that in our communities we can maintain a sustainable fishery. The last time we had a major policy shift in our country with regard away from community-based fishing to corporate fishing, Mr. Speaker, we saw what happened. The boats, the large ocean-going fishing vessels that were used by corporations in this province and in Newfoundland destroyed the cod fishery, Mr. Speaker. They raked the bottom of the ocean, and from it, they reaped more than they could sow, literally. The fish weren't able to grow fast, weren't able to keep up with the pace of the amount of fish that we were harvesting. What has been a sustainable fishery for 400 years was at risk 30, 40 years ago when we moved to the large ocean-going fishing vessels owned by corporations, and it's at risk now. We destroyed some of those fish stocks already. They may never come back. Mr. Speaker, now we need to look at how we can ensure that things like lobster fisheries, things like crab fisheries, things like that in many cases are being done at a local level. Tuna. These things need to be maintained at the local level. Communities need to have control, either as a group or by individuals in those communities. We need to ensure their licenses stay in the community. And the Fisheries Loan Board, Mr. Speaker, must be doing more to ensure that happens. They must be, I would argue, providing assistance to young fishermen, young fishing women who want to buy in the licenses, whether it's their parents, whether it is their relatives, whether it's someone in the community. They should be able to access the funds. And if it isn't through this, there must be another way in which we can do it. Not to talk about a bill before the House, Mr. Speaker, but we have suggested tax credits for those who are there's a lot of fishermen retiring in the next few years, so that they're able to pass it on to loved ones, their children, others, Mr. Speakers, and then be able to ensure they're not going to have to pay the tax on it. In theory, a fisherman can hand a license to his son or his daughter and say, I want you to fish it. And here's my lobster license, worth what, $1 million, $1.1 million in some places? I know from where I am in Eastern Passage all the way over to Digby's, the most lucrative lobster fishery probably in the world. And because it's been maintained, there have been quotas. You look what happened in Maine, and at least we've had some controls. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, these licenses are worth $1 million, upwards of $1 million. Now, they can hand that to their son and say, you know what, I don't need that money, you take it. But then they have to pay tax on it. They have to pay the capital gains tax on that. And I'm not sure exactly what the rate is for capital gains, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even if they gave it to their son or daughter for free, they have to pay the equivalent of the tax on the fair market value of that license, because we do not exempt fishermen and their licenses and their boats from capital gains like we do farmers and the land that they have. That's wrong, and that's something this province has to do. Now, this province can hold its hands and say federal government is in charge of these issues, but I think it's important to understand that we have our own tax code now. We decoupled a few years ago the former Minister of Finance from the same riding as the current Minister of Fisheries, provided that we decoupled our tax code, which gives us the opportunity through the tax system to do things our own way. Tax credits, other incentives to ensure that we are doing what we can. Is it everything? Maybe not. Does the federal government have to get involved? Absolutely. But to sit here and say, to stand in this House and say, I have to wait for the federal government to act, is only fiddling while Rome burns, Mr. Speaker. We're keeping out of the hands of our communities licenses that are going to be bought by corporations, bought by individuals and corporations based in more central locations, and it's going to be the destruction of the villages and the fishing communities in Nova Scotia. It's not going to happen overnight. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's like they say about the frog. You can put a frog in boiling water and the frog will jump out of the water. Or you can put a frog in regular water and turn up the heat. And slowly, the frog will die. Slowly and in such a way that it's not perceptible to them that the heat is going up. But it's that kind of slow death that we're seeing in our communities. We're seeing in our fishing villages. We were lucky in many cases in Nova Scotia, at least on my part of the coast, Mr. Speaker, and down the South Shore and into Yarmouth and Digby area, that the lobster fishery has maintained its viability. I know, Mr. Speaker, in your area, in the Northumberland Strait, it's not the same issue. I know that in that area there has been a lot of issues raised about the depletion of the quota, depletion of the catches with regard to lobster. And in many cases, lobster was the one thing that kept Nova Scotia different than Newfoundland. While the Newfoundland fishery was destroyed because they were so dependent on what we might say is less expensive fish stocks, lobster licenses in many ways is the one thing that, for the number of months that you're able to fish them, that Nova Scotians can rely on for that income, that stability. That's in question now in parts of the province like yours. In parts of the province like mine, Mr. Speaker, I think the catches have actually been more abundant than they've ever been, or they've been pretty good anyway. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, we have a situation where those fisheries are still viable. But for how long? And things like the Fishery Loan Board that we're talking about in Bill 257, we have to do more than just say, again, good first step, addressing the fact that we are going to ensure that these fishermen who want to buy a boat have the ability to take out more of a loan than they currently do. Great idea. Has to go further. Government needs to talk about a strategy, whether it's through the loan board or through the tax code or through other means, about how we're going to ensure that the transfer of licenses and boats from one generation to the next, from one person in a community to another person in a community, not to a corporation, not to a trust fund of some sort, but to individuals in that community, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that we're going to be able to let that happen. Government is doing things now to encourage people to leave rural Nova Scotia, from the closing of small schools and the consolidating them in larger centres, to the lack of development of roads and infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. We're doing things to encourage people to leave. Why isn't it time for this government and this minister to do something to make sure we're actually helping people stay in their communities? That's what we need to do, Mr. Speaker. That's what we have to do to make sure that our fishing communities remain viable. This bill needs to go a lot further in ensuring that Nova Scotians, particularly rural Nova Scotians, people working in the fishing industry, maintain what we have. It's a sustainable industry. It has been for 400 years, Mr. Speaker. Let's not lose it by failing to act. Thank you.
Thank you, member. We'll now recognize the member from Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I look forward to having some time discussing this particular piece of legislation, Bill 257, which is, after all, a step in the right direction. It is going to facilitate, when it comes to making dollars available in a somewhat more acceptable fashion than in the past. It's something that we're looking forward to going to law amendments. But I also think it's an important time that I take this opportunity to bring to the floor of this House some of the very concerns that I've heard from fishermen from throughout the community that I represent. I took the opportunity this afternoon, when I was aware of the fact that this piece of legislation was going to come forward, Mr. Speaker, to make a few calls, to various friends of mine, men, women I've known for many years who are involved in the fishing industry. And for the member from Dartmouth North in particular, but for other members, I think it'd be appropriate to take a bit of a tour of the coastal communities in the riding that I represent, but also to point out to the member from Chester St. Margaret's, and I look forward to her comments on this particular bill, because one of the calls I placed this afternoon was to Lloyd McRae of L.R. McRae Fisheries, who lives in Hackett's Cove, which of course is in Chester St. Margaret's. And Lloyd has one simple message when it comes to a piece of legislation and anything to do with the fishing industry. As he says all the time, no one listens to us. No one listens to us at the end of the government wharf. Instead, they listen to the bureaucrats and the suits when it comes to making the decisions that affect the everyday industry that has meant so much to Nova Scotians for so long. So for the next few minutes, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take the opportunity to bring that message through loud and clear. You know, in the years that I've had the privilege of serving in this House, when it comes to a debate on the fishery, we have had far too few of them. And we look at what is happening in coastal communities, we look at what's happening in rural Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker. I want you to know that there are frustrations when these people who are involved in the fishery industry do not feel they are being listened to. They do not feel their values or their opinions are valued. They believe that they should have a lot more say in terms of how things get done. You know, whether it's Halifax or whether it's Ottawa, whether it's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans federally or the provincial department, I mean, the people who on the water are the experts when it comes to this particular issue. And they are frustrated with the fact that they're not being listened to. So I want to bring that message to the members opposite, to the member from Chester St. Margaret's in particular. Lloyd McRae of Hackett's Cove remains frustrated with the fact that after over 35 years in the fishing industry, he does not believe that the decision makers in either downtown Halifax or downtown Ottawa consider his valued experience really of any value at all. And I want to, if I may, Mr. Speaker, highlight the fact that I've had the opportunity over the last few weeks in community events in the fishing villages to meet a number of young men and young women who are interested in continuing the tradition of their fathers and their mothers and being involved in the fishing industry. Now, many of them have trades, many of them work at other jobs, but they value the fishing industry. Not just the lobster industry, but they value the fishing industry, and they see that after all, the salt of the earth, the heart and soul of this province remains in coastal communities. And I know there's members opposite over there who represent these sorts of communities, communities that will, after all, still breathe the very life and breath that we have to have in rural Nova Scotia, in the coastal communities. And so for the member from Dartmouth North in particular, I think it would be important that I take him, first of all, as we've done in the past when he's been on tours of my constituency with me, that I take him to the scenic community of Terrence Bay. Terrence Bay, that historic community, and its wonderful small school, and of course the very identity of what a fishing village is the school and the church, the SS Atlantic Memorial, and that terrible disaster which took place on April 1st, 1873. And let me tell you, Madam Speaker, there's probably no more meaningful event than the last Sunday in July in the community of Terrence Bay at the Blessing of the Fleet. The Blessing of the Fleet is a traditional time in fishing villages around this province when it's an opportunity for members of all faiths to join in a harbor, to take a few moments to recognize the contribution of those who've gone down to the sea. And in many cases, many of them have not returned. It's a moving religious ceremony, but it's also really a celebration of a way of life. And I think it's important as legislators that we continue to make this way of life a viable way of life for young men and young women who are willing to pick up the cause of the fishery, and they are willing to continue to contribute to the economy of rural and coastal Nova Scotia. In the community of Terrence Bay, there is an outstanding young man by the name of Sean Jollymore. And Madam Speaker, as you well know, in a previous career when I had a real job, Sean Jollymore was a student of mine. Sean Jollymore has a trade. Sean Jollymore works in Halifax, yet he is looking forward to taking over his father's fishing licenses. He's looking forward to continuing to have the opportunity to be his own boss and to get out in the water and make a living. Sean Jollymore lives and breathes as Nova Scotians, particularly living in the Terrence Bay community. He has told me before that when he has the opportunity to be at sea, he's free. And you have to sense that at times. And Madam Speaker, I invite you, as I've invited the member from Dartmouth North and other members of my caucus, to come out onto the water and sense that freedom. And of course, while you're there, to do some work. Because let me tell you, as you well know, Madam Speaker, you can always tell a hardworking man or woman by the calluses on their hands, the physical labor that's involved in the fishing industry. Sean Jollymore looks forward to taking over his dad's fishing licenses. He looks forward to continuing the tradition of fishing in the community of Terrence Bay. But Sean Jollymore is much like Lloyd McRae, Madam Speaker. He shares the frustrations. You know, he is working on the government wharf in Terrence Bay, and a fisheries official shows up. And they have all the rules and all the regulations, and as Sean has told his old teacher, that being me, they have everything, but they don't have common sense. They haven't had to make a living as we have had to make a living, or as our fathers and grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers have had to make a living on the sea. The reality of wanting to continue the fishing industry, the concern that these young men and women are expressing, are something that officials provincially and federally should listen to. And if we leave the community of Terrence Bay and just go down a little bit further along the coast, we'll come to the community of Lower Prospect. Lower Prospect is that community that was so savagely hurt by Hurricane Juan. And I can remember the day after Hurricane Juan, a legendary fisherman by the name of Gerald Blackburn was interviewed on CBC. And the reporter from the CBC asked Gerald, "So how did you spend the night?" And Gerald said in his own way, "I spent it on my boat." The reporter, of course, was going, "In the middle of a hurricane, you were on your boat?" As he said, with good reflection on his wonderful wife, "My first love is my fishing boat." And nothing was going to happen to it. He spent that night of Hurricane Juan on his boat. And that next day, as if you remember, Madam Speaker, as you know, the calm after the storm, I remember it so well because I was in the community of Lower Prospect at that time. The CBC reporters, the ATV News, everyone was there. And of course, they wanted to talk to real fishermen. And I remember what Gerald Blackburn said to me at the time. It's about time they started to listen to us. Maybe now that I've got the camera in front of me, I can bring up some of my other concerns. But it was hard for anyone to understand when it comes to a hurricane and you're involved in saving your most valued possession, you are actually in the cove or up the river or up, as they say in Terrence Bay, the Terrence Bay Gut, and you are riding out the storm in the most precious thing you have. And I'm sure his sons and his wife and his other children are precious to him. But he rode the storm out on his fishing boat. Now, Madam Speaker, I want you to know that Gerald Blackburn is frustrated with how at times he just does not get listened to. This particular piece of legislation, when I have the opportunity on Friday, and I want you to know, Madam Speaker, that usually on Fridays I take the opportunity when the House adjourns, or of course if we are not in session, I spend every Friday in the fishing villages. And I can tell you there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of the members of my caucus know probably the best reason, but the second reason, of course, is I have an opportunity to be able to listen to these men and their women about the type of week they've had on the water. And they look at some of the concerns that they can bring to my attention when I go into the community of Lower Prospect or I go into the community of Terrence Bay. And let me tell you, Madam Speaker, I'm not asking them to come to my office. I'm going to where they are. So when you sit down at the end of the government wharf, and I must tell you, it's a Friday afternoon, they've had a busy day, you have the opportunity to sit there and have a refreshment with them. I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, they are plain-speaking Nova Scotians. They are hard-working Nova Scotians. They honestly believe that they have something to continue to contribute to the economy of this province. But they want to be listened to. They want to be trusted. They want to feel valued. And many of these people of all ages do not feel like they are listened to, do not feel that they are valued. And I can tell that the minister opposite, the good member from Cumberland North, in a previous position where he was involved in assisting fishermen in my community, I want to compliment him again for how that was handled at the time. And I want to, in particular, remind the minister opposite about another young man in the community of Terrence Bay, Lower Prospect, by the name of William Slonwhite. Not Bill, not Billy, William Slonwhite, because that's the name that this young man has always gone by. And his father, William Slonwhite Sr. William is a hard-working fisherman. He makes a living at it. He's a full-time fisherman. That is his source of income. And he proudly can provide for his two young elementary-age children. He lives in a very modest but very well-maintained home, and he is proud of the fact that he has the status of a full-time fisherman. And after Hurricane Juan took a swat at William Slonwhite's fish shack, this government and that minister over there, to his credit, responded and helped out young men like William Slonwhite. And Mr. Slonwhite, along with Mr. Blackburn and various other people in the community, felt valued from that experience. The people in that particular government department, they listened to these men, they assisted these men, and they assisted their wives when it came to filling out the forms, to making sure that they, on that particular occasion, were going to be able to get back up and get back to the job that they love. And I use the word job, Madam Speaker, but you know, it's a love, it's a passion, It's something that they look forward to every day doing. And I know you sense that. I mean, we've all had our bad days and our good days. But William Slonwhite or Gerald Blackburn or Sean Jollymore can tell you they love to go fishing. And they want to continue that. They want to continue that because they know it's an important part of the traditional way of life in this province. With new improvements, with new technology, with some of the things that, after all, will make them more efficient on the water, these young men and women in those two communities want to continue to make the fishing industry an integral part of the success of this province. And as we continue down the coast, Madam Speaker, I want you, for the members of my caucus, and they've been in the community before on other occasions, and I had the opportunity on Sunday afternoon to visit the historic village of Prospect itself. Now, Prospect is one of those villages that at the time that Halifax was being settled, there were more people living in the village of Prospect than lived in the military town of Halifax. That particular village has a strong fishing tradition. That particular village wants to make sure that the young men and young women and some of the older men and women involved in the fishing industry in that community are continued to be listened to, because it's of some real importance that they feel that their opinions are valued. Now, Madam Speaker, I go down a little bit further along the coast and I come to the community of Shad Bay. Once we get off past the Shad Bay Bridge, we are then in the community of Chester St. Margaret's. But I think it's important that I bring forward some concerns, because if I have the opportunity later tonight in another social event, which with the hours of the House it might be possible this evening, I have the opportunity to meet Lionel and Eugene Young. Lionel and Eugene Young, Madam Speaker, live in the community of Dover. And they, of course, are the two men who run the Dover Pride. Now, I want you to know that name of that ship is a real name of significance in the community of West Dover. The young men, and I'm speaking of Lionel and Eugene, are two hard-working fishermen who've made a great living on the water. Yet, Madam Speaker, when they want a particular piece of highway improved, or if they want repairs to their wharf, or if they're looking at some concern in their local school, they feel that because of where they live, and perhaps because of their profession, they are not exactly listened to. And I've told Lionel and Eugene Young, and I've told their wives this many times, you continue to speak up. You continue to have your say, because you are an important and integral part of what happens in this province. You might live in a community that a lot of people look and go, oh, that's the community just over from Peggy's Cove. But let me tell you something. Fishermen such as Lionel and Eugene Young and their opinions on whether it's dangerous road conditions, whether it's improved schools, or whether it's helped to repair the government wharf in the community of West Dover, those opinions have to be valued, because those opinions are the opinions of real Nova Scotians who really know what's going on in an important industry in this province. Now, you know, we can always point to other levels of government. We can point to the feds and what they don't do. And the members of the third party get upset, and we, of course, do that. But, of course, we can point to the provincial government, and they're the ones constantly saying, you know, it's Minister Regan, he hasn't done this, and he hasn't done that. See, fishermen, they don't want to hear that. They want answers. Fishermen want to feel valued, and they want to have their opinions listened to. And when they call us at our offices, they're not particularly interested when the answer comes back, oh, that's a federal issue, you better call Jeff, right? As in Mr. Regan. And of course the answer is, they've called my office, or the member from Chester St. Margaret's office, or the member from Eastern Passage's office. They don't want the buck passed. They want some assistance and help. They want some guidance, and they want some direction. They want to feel that their opinion is being listened to. And as I come up the coast, and of course I'm no longer in the riding of Timberley Prospect, I have the opportunity on a fairly regular basis to drop into McCrae's Fisheries, which is in Paul's Point in the community of Hackett's Cove. Now, there's many people's opinions politically that I've valued over the years, some of them members of this caucus. But let me assure you that when it comes to political opinions, there's none that I value more than Lloyd McCrae. L.R. McCrae of McCrae's Fisheries has worked hard all his life. He's an independent fisherman. He, of course, is in the tuna business, and he works hard each and every day. But Lloyd feels at times that his opinion is not valued, that his ideas are not listened to, and that he believes that if we're going to continue to have a vibrant fishery, if we're going to continue to have the tuna industry working well in Nova Scotia, why not turn to an expert? Why not turn to somebody who's worked in the fishing business for over 40 years? Why not turn to somebody who really knows what's going on at the end of the government wharf or out on the water? But instead, when you can sense the frustration, when they're busy at work in the fish plant and things are happening all around them, and an inspector shows up and everything has to be shut down, everything has to be looked at, and a particular guy in a clipboard and a suit is suddenly going to be telling these hardworking men and women as they process another tuna for shipment to Japan how it should or should not be done. Now let me tell you, plain-spoken people in coastal communities aren't going to put up with that nonsense. They understand it's an important role of government to monitor, to advise, to make sure that the expertise is there. But if we're going to continue to have the confidence of fishermen across this community, across this province, in whatever community, they have to feel that they're being listened to, and they have to feel that their opinions are being valued. Now, this particular piece of legislation, Madam Speaker, has some merit. It is, after all, understanding the process and facilitating these loans, and hopefully it will have the opportunity to encourage other young men and women to take up the tradition that their parents, their mothers, fathers, grandmothers, and grandfathers have been involved in over the years. It's a good first step. It's a step that this caucus is willing to support, and it's a step that hopefully when we go on to law amendments, there will be an opportune time for some of these men and women to come forward and saying, it's a good step, what's the next one? Because we look forward to having you listen to rural Nova Scotians and to coastal communities around this province. And with those comments, Madam Speaker, I'll take my spot. I thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure sharing my thoughts with you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize the honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to have a few moments to be able to speak on Bill 257, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act, or I guess as it's officially known, an act to amend Chapter 25 of the Acts of 1996, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act. And as my colleagues previous to me have spoken, it is a very important issue. The fishing industry here in Nova Scotia, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's adding a lot of value, especially to rural Nova Scotia, because that's, of course, is where our fishing communities are located, the various wharves and various fish plants that are located around the shore of Nova Scotia. This particular bill, while it's good in its of its own self, it certainly has much more area or room for improvement. But certainly, what is there, I think, is probably is good for the boat building industry. It's certainly good for a fisherman that wants to get a brand new boat and be able to afford to build it. A loan from the Fisheries Loan Board would certainly be helpful. And as was pointed out by the minister, certainly the cost of the boats are going up, and that's with inflation. Perhaps the $500,000 limit is no longer adequate. And certainly some fishing boats are more than that, $600,000, $700,000, up to $1 million. I think it was mentioned somebody built a boat, it would cost them $2 million. So obviously the limit of $500,000 is not meeting the need that's out there in the communities. I had the opportunity a few months ago with the leader of the official opposition to visit some boat building plants in Shelburne County, and certainly very modern, efficient operations in that part of our province. A lot of fiberglass hulls and boats equipped with the very, very latest in technology, and certainly is costing us the buyer over the $500,000 limit. So I certainly support that aspect of the bill, and that I guess it allows the Governor and Council to have some flexibility and determine the amount of the loan that may be appropriate in the situation. So, Madam Speaker, from that point, I see some merit in this particular bill. But I also must comment that there's a lot here that is not designed to help many of our fishermen that want to get into the fishery and maybe buy a boat and a license and equipment. And now I come from the North Shore in Nova Scotia along the Northumberland Strait, and we have a lot of fishing families, a lot of fishing communities there that are struggling, I would say, to try to make a living. It's been a poor season along the Northumberland shore. The lobster fishery in particular was way down this year. In fact, the federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans says it was the lowest lobster catches since 1980. So in other words, in 25 years, this was the lowest catch that was recorded by our fishermen. And on the wharf, talking to fishermen, they say that they need at least a season of 5,000 pounds of lobster caught even just to break even. And this year, some of their catches were 3,200, 3,500, occasionally even less than that. So obviously, they're below the cost of break even, and with the cost of labor and bait and power and or fuel for their boats, they're going behind. It's costing them more, considerably more for their help and their materials and their bait, and if they're not catching what's required to break even, then obviously they're not making money. And certainly the lobster season is perhaps the most important part of the fishery, at least along the Northumberland shore. It's certainly true that the fishermen go out in Cape John and Skinner's Cove and Tony River and Caribou and so on, and they catch other species. They're catching herring in season. They're catching mackerel. Some of them are scallop dragging. There's a few of our fishermen that go after tuna. And I guess crab is the other major fishery that, along the Northumberland Strait anyway, that people are after. But if your lobster season is poor, then really it's hard to make it up elsewhere. And the season really hinges on May and June, during those 2 months when people are out fishing, often in icy and windy conditions early in the spring. And if they have a good season, then they can survive and support their families. If they have a poor lobster season, it really kicks off the whole year on a poor or on a sour note, and it's hard for them to make ends meet. But all around Nova Scotia, certainly there's been fishing families that have been struggling to make ends meet and have for generations. And some years has been very, very good, but these past number of years have been pretty poor. But I know in my area, talking to some of the families, such as the Langels and the Faulkners, the McDonalds, the Elliots, Logans, and so on. These are some of the well-established fishing families along our shore in Pictou and Colchester counties. And for generations they have fished, and it's sometimes difficult now to get back into the fishery. It's similar to the farming industry, and it's hard now because of the cost of quota for the dairy, for milk. It's getting very expensive to get into the fishery, or into the farming, and likewise in the fishery now. When you have a boat and a license and gear that's $500,000, or perhaps in Southwest Nova $1 million or $1.5 million, how can a young person afford that? And here, I think, Madam Speaker, is an opportunity for government to look at how can they help young new entrants get into the fishery? How can they help the retiring fishermen do just that, to get out of the business? This act, that 257, does not help the new entrant get into the business. It will help an established fisherman who wants to build a boat, a $600,000, $700,000, $1 million boat, to get the loan and to build it through a boat builder in our province. But it does not help the young person that maybe has been an apprentice on a boat, has been getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and is a helper on his neighbor's boat or on his father's boat or his uncle's boat. And now maybe this young person is fully ready. He's 25 years old and he's always been a fisherman's helper. Now he wants to get into business for himself. This act is not going to assist him in that regard. And it's really what is needed through the Fisheries Loan Board is dollars that will be available to, to make it easier for the new entrants to get into the business. Just today, Madam Speaker, one of the fishermen along the Northumberland shore was interviewed in our local paper, and he was asked about what his opinion was on the department's new boat plan. And I'll mention him by name. It's Ronnie Heighton. Mr. Heighton is the president of the Northumberland Fishermen's Association and is well respected and well known along the Northumberland shore and in fishing circles around the province and throughout the Maritimes, throughout eastern Canada. He's well known, I'm sure, to the minister and to many within the fishing industry. And he's saying this very thing that I've just mentioned, that it's not going to help new young entrants get into the fishing industry. It's perhaps good for somebody that's wanting to build a new boat that's already well established in the industry. But if a lot of the fishermen in Nova Scotia are 50 years of age or older, and they're almost at the point they're thinking about the day comes when they want to retire. And what are they going to do with their business? Where are they going to sell their boat and their license and their gear? Who's going to take over it? And perhaps they have a son or a daughter or a son-in-law or somebody that's interested in the business. Maybe that's the person that's been the fisherman's helper on the boat, getting up and going out with them every day. But how are they going to sell it? How are they going to pass it on to that young person? And as an example, I had some fishermen in my area. One in particular I can recall called me up and said that very thing. I'm 72 years of age. I want to turn this business over to my daughter and son-in-law. They want to carry on the business, and but there's no mechanism that I can get out of the business. And even if I give it away, he was telling me he's going to be hit with such a large tax burden through the federal government, and I guess it's tied together with the province as well. There's what's needed is a capital gains allowance that would indicate that, like farmers have, they have a limit of $500,000, but fishermen only have a limit of $100,000. And when your gear is worth maybe up to $500,000 or more, there's a huge tax burden there that has to be paid by somebody. And in this particular case, they went to their accountant and they talked to him about how, what mechanism is out there that we can legally, within the rules, even give this business to his son-in-law without being hit with a huge tax burden. And I think they had to incorporate, was one method they were able to get partially around it, incorporate as a business and then sell it for $1 to his son-in-law. But still, there was a fair tax implication. So, Madam Speaker, I think while this bill is good, there are a lot of problems in our fishing industry out there. The most pressing is the ability of young new entrants to try to get into the business, and I think the minister and the department could really help our fishing families if they were to allow a mechanism through the Fisheries Loan Board that would allow these young new fishermen to get into the business and allow the retiring fishermen to get out without a huge penalty, and just a way for the fishing industry to continue along our shores. It's been the stable base for our coastal economy for generations, and I think if the right things are done by this minister and by this department, that base of economic support in our coastal communities can continue for many generations to come. So with those few remarks, Madam Speaker, I'm going to take my place, and I look forward to this bill moving on to law amendments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize the Minister for Fisheries and Oceans to close debate. No? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I recognize the member from Preston.
That's all right. The Minister of Fisheries and Oceans is not here, actually. It's Minister of Fisheries.
Fisheries and Agriculture, thank you.
Yes, it's with pleasure I stand up in support of the bill this evening, because this has been long overdue in the fishing industry in Nova Scotia. It's becoming more and more difficult for people to take over the industry from other people, and even to buy a boat today is a tremendous expense. So I think this is a good move on behalf of the government. A lot of things they do I don't like, but this is one of the things I think is very positive that will help the fishing industry and help them. We'll mark one little one up. It's only a little one. Got a lot of other changes you've got to make. But it's a positive thing. I know a fishing boat one time you could go and someone buy a fishing boat with I remember my uncle was, when I was just a child, my uncle had one of those one-lung boats. I think he paid $400 for it, and was probably not that good a boat, but anyway, he made a partial living from it, and it wasn't much of a living at that time when you were lobster fishing and hand lining and doing other things, but he did manage to make a living from it, brought his family up, and through his retirement years, he continued with that enterprise, and it did help him quite a bit, as it did many people in Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, the fishing industry now is becoming so sophisticated in the province of Nova Scotia today, as it is all over Canada, that it's very difficult for anyone to make any money at it unless they have the proper equipment to do it, and the equipment costs a lot of money. My honourable colleagues on the official opposition are talking about buying licenses, and as we all know, that can't happen until the federal government makes some major changes in the licensing regime. And if that were to happen, I don't think the province would have enough money in all its coffers to buy the licenses out that are so badly needed by so many people in this province. But with those few words, I want to encourage the government to move forward with this legislation. I think it's good legislation, and it should definitely help the fishing industry in Nova Scotia as it becomes more and more competitive, and allow them the opportunity to get access to good, solid funding for good, solid enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to speak to this. I think we're all grateful to see that there is a recognition on the government's part that fishing is no longer a small business. The stakes are very, very high indeed. As has been mentioned many times, the cost of a license alone is far more than most people's entire assets. And when you add to that the need to buy a vessel, the costs are stupendous and keep many, many people from pursuing what has, of course, become known as the traditional way of fishing life. In fact, there are those who believe that it's not so much the fish as the fishers who are on the verge of extinction. Nevertheless, the government's initiative to raise the loan amount available through the loan guarantee program, at least for new boats, the construction of new vessels, is certainly a welcome one, because it is not possible to buy a new boat in this day and age for anything under $500,000, and as has been pointed out, the majority of them are well over $1 million. As we are probably all aware, the cost of fiberglass is escalating with the cost of oil. The cost of materials escalate with the cost of transportation and fuel costs as well. And another thing which is in fact crippling for some of the people remaining in the fishing industry is the cost of insurance. In my constituency, fishing is one of the oldest ways of making a living. As I've pointed out only too many times, it is one of the best examples of the rocky shoreline of Nova Scotia, and it is pitted with many small coves which have been the host to small villages for well over 200 years. Villages which have accommodated a fleet of perhaps 4 or 5 boats at most, but have supported 4 or 5 families well. Those boats, though, were wooden boats, they were Cape Islanders, and if they had engines and all, they were nothing more than a one-lunger. And the industry was considerably less regulated. My constituency has been very inventive as it has continued, as the fishing industry has continued. We have one of the few fishing cooperatives left in the province, which is Sambro Fisheries. Some 26 boats operate from various points along that coastline. most of them out of Sambro, but a couple from Herring Cove, a couple from Ferguson's Cove as well. Ferguson's Cove, which doesn't even have a wharf at this point. And it was interesting, too, to see how high the stakes had gotten after Hurricane Juan, because when that hurricane hit, it was 2 days before the opening of the crab season. Now, the crab season is an important part of the fishing cycle. These, as I say, innovative and ingenious fishers working out of this plant are relying on a number of different species, not even all of them from Nova Scotia, to keep themselves working all the time. And it's important not to miss a beat during the cycle of the year, because anything constitutes a loss which may be absolutely the last blow. So the crab season was about to get going at the time. And as you may remember from photographs on television and so on, Sambro Harbour was essentially swept out. Wharves found themselves on the opposite side of the basin, sheds found themselves floating up on the far shore, and boats were damaged severely and colorfully. But people got back to work in a hurry. They were out of communication for the most part. Cell towers had been blown down as well. There was no electricity. Sambro Fisheries proved itself one of the most important members of the community at that point, because having watched the weather reports, they were well aware of what was coming. They banked on the possibility of losing electricity, and 48 hours beforehand, they shipped out all of their frozen inventory. They sent it to the southern U.S., which is where it was destined to New York and points further south. They got it out of there. And what they did was they kept on the refrigerator trucks, they kept on those generators, and they basically kept that community going throughout the aftermath of that hurricane. And one of the major activities that they undertook was the rebuilding of those wharfs. They were quick, they were effective, and they weren't right. Because after the crab season was over, while all the processing of claims was still going on, it came to the attention of the people of Sambro that they had not gotten new engineering designs for their wharfs. And they had to fight long and hard. We had to really do some negotiations in order to get those wharfs approved after the fact. They were approved, but there's a degree of grief involved in that, which really should not be have taken place on top of everything else. And as I say, the stakes are high. Building a wharf at this point is not cheap. The engineering designs, the approvals are not cheap. The insurance to own both boat and wharf is a constantly climbing exercise, the cost of licenses and gears, and of course, the heavy tax burden imposed on those who wish to transfer licenses are all things which mean that a boat is almost one of the smaller constituents of the cost of operating a fishing business. So it's been interesting to watch some of the ways in which the fishing business has continued. As I say, Sambro, the 26 boats fishing out of Sambro, do a very, very diverse business. They bring in ground fish, herring, mackerel, dogfish, blue shark, pork beagle, swordfish, urchins, crab, lobster, and various sorts of tuna. And they process all of those and more. They are transshipping mackerel from the Baltic. They bring it, they process it, they ship it back out. They are bringing salmon down from New Brunswick when necessary to process and move around the province, and they are constantly looking at the future cost of what they are bringing in. They are never idle. And this is a very, very sophisticated business, and we have to be very, very grateful that this community is in fact, that these communities are in fact willing, and we hope able, to continue doing this, because this is absolutely the heart of the economy and the history of many parts of this province, and most certainly of my constituency. It's big business, and you can see that everywhere you look along the coast. What happens to the people who are not buying a new boat? What happens to the people who are not transferring a license, or who are transferring a license and it is going out of the family? They may remain in some of the ancillary businesses to fishing. Several of them operate charter boats. although insurance again is a real problem. Others are involved in small harbors groups and leasing out space. There are those who have gone into the folk art business, which is really, a lovely thing, but it's something of a come down, quite honestly, for many of them. It's not really what they want to be doing is painting pictures of fishing boats when in fact they no longer have the license to travel in the boat they did once work in. So we have a lot of new tourist business arising on the wharfs, which are no longer used for fishing. But as I always say, I think it's important to remember that tourism is essentially an export industry. Tourism is the business of selling an experience which people will take home with them. And I think we must keep a very, very close eye when a sustainable resource of a community is replaced, in fact, by something which is based on the picturesque aspects of that resort. And I do believe that we need to be very, very careful of that, particularly in the areas closer to the metropolitan parts of the province. Sambro, however, has also prospered by the addition of the Coast Guard, and we're very glad at this point to have a new station opened, which is patrolling a large part of the coastline, some 240 miles of coastline. It's an important thing that we have, and that's a part of the contribution. And that certainly makes most of the fishing business considerably, feel considerably more secure, although we do usually, well, I shouldn't say usually, but we have in fact, lost lives in the not too distant past in this industry, which is, as everybody knows, a long time, a very dangerous one. The things which accompany the fishing industry are important. It's not just the fishing industry. And one thing that this bill addresses, which I'm very glad to see, is in fact the boat building industry. And this should be a real boost to Nova Scotia's long-standing and prestigious boat building industry. I have a couple of boat builders in my constituency in both the modern fiberglass vein. There's been experimentation even with concrete hulls back in the good old days. And of course, there are a few people still working with wooden boats. So that is an important part of maintaining an ocean economy to some degree. And we're also very lucky in my area to have the Aquaculture Research Station. This is a particularly welcome initiative, too, because it is an example of a place where the province can actually make a difference in the fishing business. As my colleague from Timberley Prospect has pointed out, there is nothing more frustrating for the people of these communities than to find themselves constantly caught in the loop of federal, provincial, and usually a federal issue. Once the fish hits land, it becomes a food issue, but before that, it's frequently out of their control or easy reach. So I'm very glad to see the province putting forward the kinds of economic development initiatives which this increased loan amounts represent, and we will hope that that, in fact, acts to continue, or to, in the measure which is in the control of the province, acts to continue the strength of the fishing industry and all those accompanying businesses and ways of life. So with that, Madam Speaker, I was done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize the Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank all the members for their interventions during this debate. I am also impressed by the interest that the members opposite have on the fishery in Nova Scotia, because it is one of our founding pieces of economy. It is a $1.2 billion industry in Nova Scotia, and one that we want to make sure stays for the long haul. And I just want to say, Madam Speaker, is that we still have more share in Nova Scotia of this than Newfoundland does, so we want to be able to keep our edge on Newfoundland on this one. I do want to make a couple comments quickly here, is that even though that the discussions here strayed a little bit away from the actual spirit of the bill, I do want to address some of the issues that were brought up, if you don't mind. the main topic, of course, is around coastal communities, is what the members opposite did talk about. And I just want to underline that our coastal communities do include Chester St. Margaret's. They do include Cumberland South, Cumberland North. They do include Inverness. They do include Queens. They do include Colchester North. They do include Clare and Lunenburg, of course, and all those areas that we're very lucky to have in our province. But specifically more about coastal communities, there was comments that did revolve around the preserving of our inshore fleet, or more specifically, the 1972 federal government fleet separation policy. Of course, in 1972, the federal government brought in a fleet separation policy which was to preserve that inshore fleet. Unfortunately, successive governments, provincial and federal, have ignored that policy until just recently. And I just want to say, Madam Speaker, is that this government, previous ministers before me, were able to bring this to the forefront, bring it to the ministerial meetings, and underline this issue of the transfer of wealth from independent community members, fishermen, to big corporations. And it has been a low and slow process, but I do want to say, Madam Speaker, that the talks have gone into a white paper. There is a Mr. Hanlon from Antigonish that has a document in hand now that is going to be releasing that to groups. And I do ask the members opposite to comment on that piece of paper as that white paper comes forward for their discussion and for their comments on protecting that inshore fleet. And I do urge them to go forward on that one. And I just want to say that our role in the province is not necessarily one of regulation when it comes to fisheries. It is more one of a lobbyist, if I might as well use that word, to make sure that the federal government does know what the fishermen are asking for. And to the member of Timberlea Prospect, to his comment of talking to fishermen, I too do go to the end of the wharf and do talk to the Floyd Dontramos, the wharf. Unfortunately, unlike the members opposite, I can swim, so I could get my way back. I do talk to the Floyd Dontramos. I do talk to the Jeff Dontramos, no relation. And I do talk to the Louis Amiros. Honestly, they're not. And not rabbit tracks there again, Madam Speaker. I do want to say that the mortgage of the boats, it has been an issue for some time now. That boats, the cost of those boats, have risen exponentially. So no longer is a little boat of a few hundred dollars available, and I wish they were in some cases. Some of these vessels are more and more technologically advanced, where they do require a lot more effort. So I do say that when it comes to the mortgaging of the license, is an issue that was brought up on a number of occasions. And this government, this Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, has pushed for this one, has lobbied for this one for a number of years now, that we are willing to take on that responsibility to be able to mortgage the license. And to no avail, that the federal government has said that they did not want us to do that. They won't allow us to take that mortgage out on that license. Of course, it is intervention of the actual fleet separation policy, which they are not adhering to anyway. So it's a bizarre little triangle there that we will continue to lobby on behalf of Nova Scotia fishermen. So quickly, I just want to just finish up my discussion and to a comment that the member from Quail Harbour Eastern Passage, he did have an analogy to frogs, and for a French guy from Argyle, I don't know how I took that one, but I do want to make comments that I do want to move and close second reading on Bill 257.
The motion is for the second reading of Bill number 257. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill 257, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 25 of the Acts of 1996, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments.
Yes,
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I would ask leave to revert to the order of business, tabling reports of committees. Thank you, Madam Speaker. As Chairman of the Committee of Law Amendments, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 230, an act to amend Chapter 213 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Housing Development Corporation Act. Bill number 236, an act to amend Chapter 430 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Small Claims Court Act. Bill number 241, an act respecting commercial mediation. Bill number 244, an act to amend Chapter 30 of the Acts of 2001, the Enforcement of Canadian Judgments and Decrees Act. Bill number 246, an act to implement the Hague Convention on the law applicable to trusts and on their recognition. Bill number 249, an act to assist in the enforcement of court orders. The committee recommends these bills to the favorable consideration of the House without amendment.
Thank you very much. Ordered that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House. Would all those in favor say aye? Don't have to vote on it? Thank you. I wonder if we could have an introduction. Yes, the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, in the West Gallery tonight, we have members of the Nova Scotia Government and General Employees Union who are mainly employed. We're mostly employed here with the Capital District Health Authority, and they're here to meet various members of the House and discuss a recent decision that impacts them financially in the workplace, and that is weekend shift premiums. And I'd like to ask the floor to welcome these guests to our gallery tonight, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Yes, we certainly welcome our special guest to the gallery today. Thank you. I'd like to recognize the Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Speaker. Call Bill number 260, the Interpretation Act. Thank you.
Bill 260?
Yes.
Yeah. Bill 260, the Interpretation Act.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would move to Bill 260.
I'd like to recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Madam Chair. Madam Speaker, I'll be very brief on this bill. This bill is here primarily because the government, if it had done its work originally and declared the bill when it should have, we wouldn't be here today. And we also know that the bill we're here to protect or to talk about is a bill that was by some corners of this province, people would say it was snuck through. It was not done in a manner that like many of the municipalities found acceptable. But nonetheless, we find ourselves here today with this bill in front of us in the Interpretations Act. I believe that it's the best thing for us to do is to allow this bill to get through the House, go to law amendments, and to see if there's any objections there, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize the member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. On Bill 260, I have to echo the comments of member from Cape Breton Centre. This perhaps two words describe this bill as proclamation delayed. When this bill came before the House, it was the will of this legislature when this bill came that this bill be passed. And when members left the legislature at the end of the spring session, we had assumed that this bill was passed indeed and would become law, which was the will of the legislature. But lo and behold, Madam Speaker, we find that many months later, this bill was still not proclaimed. Now, one has to ask, does the legislature's will prevail, or are bills altered once they leave this place or left on the shelf somewhere or not proclaimed or not attended to, directly in opposition to the will of this legislature? And I was always of the understanding, Madam Speaker, that once this legislature voted on a bill, that bill would become law in a timely fashion. This didn't happen here, and with some other bills, by the way, Madam Speaker, that were still left out there, not proclaimed, and there is no excuse for that, Madam Speaker, because this legislature has dictated that these bills would go through, would be proclaimed, and would become law. And there are bills that sometimes languish for a year before they're proclaimed. And people in Nova Scotia wonder why the new legislation is not in effect. Well, it's not in effect because the government chooses not to make sure that these bills are proclaimed in a timely fashion. And that's why we're seeing this bill here. This is a corrective measure. I agree with the bill. I agree with the bill that it's the intention of this bill to correct a mistake that was made in not proclaiming this bill in a timely fashion the last time that bill was before the House. So having said that, Madam Speaker, I too am in favor of sending this bill on to law amendments and for further debate and back to Committee of the Whole. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to rise to close debate on this bill. This bill is a bill to make clear the intention of the legislature, which was clearly that in passing the bill last year, or this year rather, last year, yes, a year ago, the session actually, that the legislature had intended to put an end to police strikes in Nova Scotia, and this is to make that clear. And with that, I'd move second reading, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much. The motion is for second reading of Bill number 260. Would all those in favor of the motion please signify by saying aye? Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill 260, entitled An Act to Protect Public Safety.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I'd like to recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Speaker. Under government business, I'd like to call private and local bills for second reading.
Okay. Yeah, the motion is to call private and local bills for second reading.